The criminal gangs, which would come to dominate Victorian London's underworld, emerged in the decades following the 1820s, as the city underwent a transformation unprecedented in human history. The most notorious of these organizations was known as the 40 Thieves, a gang which operated out of the Elephant and Castle district of South London from at least the 1820s onwards, and which would, in later decades, become known by the alternative name of the 40 Elephants, a name which would strike fear into the hearts of shopkeepers throughout London's West End. The Elephant and Castle, named after a public house which had stood at the major road junction since the 18th century, was located in the borough of Southwark, approximately 1 mile south of the River Thames and 2 miles south of the City of London itself. The origin of the name itself has been debated by historians, with some suggesting it derived from a corruption of the Spanish Infanta de Castilla, a reference to Eleanor of Castile, who was the wife of King Edward the Sound, while others have argued that it simply referred to the sign which hung outside the original public house, depicting an elephant with a castle or howdah on its back, an image which had been popular in heraldry and inn signs since medieval times. Whatever its origin, the name would become synonymous with crime and poverty throughout the Victorian period. The area had developed as a coaching stop in the Georgian period, serving travellers on the roads connecting London to the south coast ports of Dover, Brighton, and Portsmouth. In the 18th century, it had been a relatively prosperous area, with coaching inns, stables, and businesses catering to travellers, providing employment and income for local residents. However, by the time Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, the area had undergone a dramatic transformation and had become something quite different. The coming of the railways in the 1830s and 1840s had destroyed the coaching trade almost overnight, as passengers who had previously travelled by coach now took the train, and the inns and businesses which had depended on coaching traffic found themselves without customers and without purpose. The district was characterised by dense housing, much of it hastily constructed to accommodate the thousands of migrants flooding into London from the countryside in search of work in the city's expanding industries. These dwellings were cramped, poorly ventilated, and often lacked basic sanitation. Buildings were typically constructed as quickly and cheaply as possible by speculative builders interested only in maximizing the number of units they could cram onto a piece of land, with no thought given to the comfort or health of the future occupants. Rooms were small and dark, with windows often too small to provide adequate ventilation or light. Walls were thin, providing no privacy and allowing noise, smells, and vermin to pass freely between dwellings. Multiple families would share single rooms, with different families occupying different corners and hanging sheets or blankets to create some semblance of privacy. In some cases, as many as 20 or 30 people might live in a single house which had been built to accommodate one family. Beds were shared, with family members sleeping in shifts according to their work schedules, so that a bed might never be empty, with one worker sleeping during the day while another slept at night. Those who could not afford even a shared bed would pay a penny or twopence to sleep on the floor or sitting upright on a bench. Entire streets consisted of what contemporaries termed rookeries, a word derived from the crowded nesting habits of rooks, which describe the teeming slum districts where crime flourished and where even the most basic standards of respectable living seemed impossible to maintain. The term rookery had first been applied to such districts in the late 18th century and had become common parlance by the Victorian period. These rookeries were characterized not only by poverty and overcrowding, but by a deliberate rejection of or exclusion from respectable society, creating communities which existed outside the norms of Victorian civilization and which operated according to their own rules and customs. It was in this environment that the 40 Thieves established their operations. The gang, which despite its name, often numbered far more than 40 members at any given time, specialized initially in shoplifting, pickpocketing, and the fencing of stolen goods. The number 40 in the gang's name was likely chosen not for its accuracy, but for its resonance with the famous story of Ali Baba and the 40 thieves from the Arabian Nights, suggesting that the gang members saw themselves as romantic outlaws in the tradition of that tale. In reality, the gang's membership fluctuated considerably, with some estimates suggesting that at its peak in the late Victorian period, it may have included as many as 200 women who were either full members or who worked regularly with the organization. The organization was unusual in Victorian criminal circles, in that it was dominated by women, a fact which shocked contemporary observers who believed that criminality was primarily a male vice, and that women who engaged in crime had violated not only the law, but the fundamental nature of femininity itself. Victorian gender ideology held that women were naturally more moral and virtuous than men, and the existence of female criminal gangs challenged these assumptions in uncomfortable ways. The 40 Thieves maintained close associations with male gangs operating in the same territory, particularly the Elephant and Castle Boys, who provided muscle and protection when disputes arose with rival criminal organizations or when dealings with particularly dangerous fences and receivers required a show of force. The relationship between the female and male gangs was complex, involving elements of partnership, mutual dependence, and at times tension over questions of authority and the division of proceeds from criminal activities. By the 1840s, the 40 Thieves had developed a sophisticated operation which would serve as a model for organized criminal activity throughout the Victorian period. Female members, often dressed in elaborate clothing designed specifically to conceal stolen goods, would travel north into the more affluent shopping districts of the West End. The journey from the Elephant and Castle to the West End shopping districts was typically made by omnibus, the horse-drawn public vehicles which provided transport around London, or later in the period by underground railway, once the Metropolitan line had been extended to serve South London. The women would blend in with other shoppers, and their expensive clothing ensured that they would not attract suspicion from shop staff, who naturally assumed that well-dressed women were legitimate customers with money to spend. There, they would target the growing number of department stores and drapers' shops, which were beginning to transform London's retail landscape in the middle decades of the 19th century. These new large-scale retail establishments represented a revolution in shopping, bringing together under one roof a variety of goods which previously would have been sold in separate specialized shops. The department store format created both opportunities and vulnerabilities From a security perspective, the opportunities for customers included the ability to browse extensive selections and to compare products. But these same features created opportunities for thieves, as the constant movement of customers and the difficulty of tracking merchandise made theft much easier than in smaller shops where proprietors personally knew their regular customers and kept close watch on strangers. The stolen items, which ranged from silk and lace to jewelry and small valuable objects, would then be transported back to the Elephant and Castle, where an extensive network of receivers would purchase the goods at a fraction of their retail value before selling them on through various channels, including market traders, small shopkeepers, and dealers who would transport the goods to provincial cities, where the risk of detection was considerably lower. The entire operation, from theft to final sale, was carefully organized and efficient, demonstrating a level of business acumen which rivaled that of legitimate enterprises and which suggested that the women who ran the 40 Thieves possessed considerable organizational and entrepreneurial abilities, which in a different social context might have been employed in respectable commerce. The gang's influence in South London was considerable and extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of the Elephant and Castle. By the mid-Victorian period, the 40 Thieves controlled significant criminal activity, not just in the Elephant and Castle itself, but in the surrounding areas of Walworth, Newington, and the Borough, districts which were all characterized by poverty and which provided fertile recruiting ground for the gang. This territorial dominance would be maintained in one form or another for decades to come, persisting from the 1820s well into the 20th century, and would establish patterns of criminal organization which would persist even after the specific individuals who had founded the gang had died or retired from criminal activity. The gang functioned as an institution which transcended individual members, with younger women being recruited and trained to replace older members who retired, creating continuity across generations. It is worth reflecting on the development of Victorian London, with which these criminal gangs would become so intrinsically associated, as the city's transformation in the 19th century created the conditions which allowed such organizations to emerge and flourish. The site which would become Victorian London had been settled for centuries, with its origins dating back to the Roman founding of Londinium in approximately 43 AD. But the city which emerged in the 19th century bore little resemblance to what had come before, either in scale, character, or social organization. In 1801, at the dawn of the new century, and at a time when Britain was engaged in a desperate struggle against Napoleonic France, London's population stood at approximately 1 million people, making it already the largest city in Europe and one of the largest cities in the world, exceeded only by Beijing and possibly by a few other Asian cities, for which reliable population figures were not available. However, this was merely the beginning of an unprecedented demographic explosion which would transform the character of the city entirely and which would create social problems on a scale never before encountered in human history. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun transforming Britain in the late 18th century with the development of water-powered cotton mills in the north of England and the application of steam power to manufacturing, accelerated dramatically in the early decades of the 19th century. Factories, mills, and workshops proliferated across the country, particularly in the industrial cities of the Northern Midlands, such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds. But it was London, as the capital and the centre of commerce, trade, finance, and empire, which attracted the greatest influx of workers seeking employment. The city's role as the centre of Britain's vast trading network and as the hub of the British Empire ensured that economic opportunities, however meagre the wages and harsh the conditions, were more abundant in London than in other parts of the country. Rural labourers, displaced by agricultural mechanisation and the enclosure of common lands, which had provided subsistence for countless families for generations, flooded into the city in search of work and opportunity, often arriving with little more than the clothes on their backs and a desperate hope that the great metropolis would provide the means of survival which the countryside no longer offered. The enclosure movement, which had been proceeding gradually since the 16th century, but which accelerated dramatically in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, transformed English agriculture from a system of small-scale farming on common lands to a system of large enclosed farms operated by tenant farmers working for wealthy landowners. This transformation, while increasing agricultural productivity and profits for landowners, displaced hundreds of thousands of rural labourers who had previously supported themselves through a combination of wage labour and subsistence farming on common lands. These displaced agricultural workers had few options other than migration to cities, and London, as the largest city and the capital, attracted a disproportionate share of these migrants. As a result, the population increased at an extraordinary rate, which astonished contemporaries and which created unprecedented challenges for urban administration and governance. By 1851, the year of the Great Exhibition, which showcased Britain's industrial and imperial power to the world in the specially constructed Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, London's population had swelled to over 2.5 million people, representing a growth of 1.5 million people in just 50 years, a rate of increase which had never been seen before in human history. By 1881, 30 years later, it had reached 4.5 million, nearly doubling again in just 3 decades. And by 1901, at the end of Victoria's 63-year reign, the population of Greater London exceeded 6.5 million people, making it not only the largest city in Europe, but the largest city in the world, exceeding even the great urban centers of Asia, such as Tokyo, and the rapidly expanding cities of the United States, such as New York and Chicago. This growth was not distributed evenly across the metropolis, and different parts of London experienced very different patterns of development and demographic change. The East End, comprising the districts of Whitechapel, Spitalfields, Bethnal Green, Stepney and Shadwell, absorbed vast numbers of the poorest migrants, both from rural England and from overseas, particularly Ireland and later Eastern Europe. These areas, located to the east of the City of London and adjacent to the expanding docks along the Thames, where ships from across the British Empire unloaded their cargoes of tea from India and China, cotton from America and Egypt, wool from Australia, and countless other commodities which sustained Britain's industrial economy and its role as the world's premier trading nation, became synonymous with poverty, overcrowding, and crime in the Victorian imagination. The docks themselves, which had been massively expanded in the early 19th century, with the construction of the West India Docks, the London Docks, and the St. Catherine Docks provided employment for tens of thousands of casual labourers. But the work was irregular and poorly paid, and competition for jobs was fierce, with hundreds of men gathering each morning in the hope of being selected for a day's work. Similarly, areas of South London, such as Southwark, Bermondsey, and Lambeth, experienced rapid and largely uncontrolled development, with speculative builders throwing up cheap housing with little regard for sanitation, ventilation, or the basic requirements of human habitation. Southwark, located immediately south of London Bridge, and therefore having ancient origins as the first area south of the Thames to be developed, had once been a relatively prosperous area, but by the Victorian period, it had declined into poverty and squalor. Bermondsey, further east along the south bank of the Thames, was dominated by tanneries and other industries, which produced noxious smells and pollution, making it one of the least desirable areas of London. Lambeth, to the west, was slightly more respectable, but still characterized by poverty and overcrowding. One of the most notorious slum districts was the area known as Seven Dials in the West End, located near Covent Garden. This small district, consisting of 7 narrow streets, converging at a junction marked by a pillar with 7 sundials, which had been erected in the late 17th century, but which had been removed in 1773, became infamous for its criminal population, despite its proximity to some of London's most fashionable addresses. The area's name derived from the junction where 7 streets met, creating a confusing intersection which provided easy escape routes for criminals and which made police pursuit difficult. Despite being within walking distance of the theatres and gentlemen's clubs of the West End, just a few hundred yards from the fashionable streets where the wealthy promenaded, Seven Dials was characterized by crumbling tenements, gin shops, and a population engaged primarily in petty crime and prostitution. The contrast between this squalid rookery and the grand streets surrounding it exemplified the stark divisions which characterized Victorian London and which shocked many middle-class observers who ventured into the slums to observe conditions there. The infrastructure required to support this massive population expansion was slow to develop, and the city struggled to keep pace with the demands placed upon it by the influx of migrants and the growth of industry and commerce. The first railway stations began to appear in London in the 1830s and 1840s, fundamentally transforming the city's geography and economy by creating new centres of activity and commerce around the major termini. Major railway stations such as Euston opened in 1837, serving the London and Birmingham Railway and becoming the first major railway terminus in London. Paddington in 1838, serving the Great Western Railway and providing connections to Bristol and the west of England. King's Cross in 1852, serving the Great Northern Railway and connecting London to the industrial cities of the north, and St Pancras in 1868, serving the Midland Railway and becoming famous for its Gothic revival architecture. The Metropolitan Railway, the world's first underground railway, opened in 1863, connecting Paddington to Farringdon Street and pioneering a form of urban transport which would be replicated in major cities across the world, including New York, Paris, and eventually cities on every continent. However, these developments, while transformative for commerce and communication, and while making it possible for middle-class workers to commute from suburban homes to offices in the city, often exacerbated social problems by displacing thousands of poor residents whose homes were demolished to make way for railway lines and stations with little or no compensation provided and no alternative accommodation arranged. The construction of railway lines through densely populated areas required the destruction of entire streets and neighborhoods, and the poor people who lived in these areas had no political power to resist the railways and no resources to secure compensation or alternative housing. Housing conditions in the poorest districts were appalling by any standard, whether judged by contemporary middle-class norms or by modern standards. Entire families lived in single rooms, often sharing those rooms with other families or with lodgers who paid a few pence per night for the privilege of sleeping on the floor or in a bed which they shared with strangers. A typical room in a rookery might measure 12 feet by 10 feet and house a family of 6 or 8 people, or even more if lodgers were taken in to help pay the rent. Buildings lacked proper sanitation, with toilet facilities often consisting of a single privy in a courtyard shared by dozens or even hundreds of people, and water supplies were frequently contaminated by proximity to cesspits and the general accumulation of filth in streets and courts which were never properly cleaned. In many areas, water was available only from a single standpipe in a courtyard which might serve 50 or 100 families, and this standpipe might be turned on for only a few hours per week, forcing residents to queue to fill buckets and containers which would provide their water supply until the standpipe was turned on again. Diseases such as cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis were endemic, and epidemics swept through the poorest districts with terrible regularity, killing thousands and creating periodic public health crises which alarmed authorities and sparked demands for sanitary reform. The cholera outbreak of 1848-49, which was part of a global cholera pandemic, killed over 14,000 Londoners, while the 1853-54 outbreak claimed over 10,000 lives, with the deaths concentrated overwhelmingly in the poorest districts where sanitation was worst. The great physician John Snow demonstrated during the 1854 outbreak that cholera was spread through contaminated water rather than through bad air, as was commonly believed, by showing that cases clustered around a particular water pump in Soho. But his findings were initially dismissed by many medical authorities who clung to the miasma theory of disease. Tuberculosis, or consumption as it was then called, was even more deadly than cholera, killing slowly rather than quickly, but claiming even more lives over the course of the Victorian period, with estimates suggesting that tuberculosis was responsible for approximately 1 in 4 deaths in Victorian London. The life expectancy in the poorest areas of the East End was less than half that of residents in the affluent West End, with many children dying before their 5th birthday, and with adults who survived childhood rarely living beyond their 40s. In the most impoverished districts, infant mortality rates exceeded 300 deaths per 1,000 live births, meaning that nearly 1 in 3 babies died before reaching their 1st birthday. This compared to infant mortality rates of fewer than 100 per 1,000 in the wealthiest districts, demonstrating the stark inequality in health outcomes which existed within a single city. These differences in life expectancy and infant mortality were not primarily the result of medical knowledge or technology, as medical care for the poor was limited in any case, but rather reflected differences in nutrition, housing conditions, sanitation, and exposure to disease. Moreover, the economic structure of Victorian London created vast inequalities, which seemed to many observers to be growing rather than diminishing as the century progressed and as Britain's economy expanded. While the middle and upper classes prospered enormously from Britain's industrial and imperial expansion, accumulating wealth which allowed them to build grand houses in new suburban developments such as Kensington, Hampstead, and Clapham, and to employ numerous servants to attend to their comfort and to insulate them from the practical difficulties of daily life. Much of the working class lived in desperate poverty. Employment for the poor was often casual and irregular, with labourers gathering each morning at docks and markets, hoping to be hired for a day's work, with no guarantee of employment tomorrow, and no provision for times of illness or economic downturn when work might not be available for weeks or months at a time. Women and children were employed in factories, workshops, and as domestic servants under harsh conditions and for minimal wages, which were often insufficient to support a family, with women typically earning half or less of what men earned for comparable work, and children earning even less. Thousands survived through street trading, selling flowers, matches, food, or scavenged items, eking out a precarious existence on the margins of legality, as many forms of street trading were illegal without a license, which cost money that the poorest could not afford. The result of this was a city with enormous wealth concentrated in certain areas and grinding poverty in others, with little in the way of social provision to bridge the gap or to assist those who fell into destitution. The contrast between the grand terraces of Belgravia and Mayfair, where the aristocracy and wealthy merchants resided in palatial townhouses attended by liveried servants, and where a single family might occupy a house with 20 or 30 rooms, and the fetid rookeries of the East End and South London, where families huddled in single rooms and struggled to obtain even clean water or adequate food, was stark and shocking to those who observed both worlds. Some middle-class observers who ventured into the slums described feeling as though they had entered a foreign country. So different were conditions in the poorest districts from anything they had experienced in their own comfortable lives. And this inequality, combined with inadequate policing and the absence of any effective social welfare system, created ideal conditions for organized crime to flourish. By the 1840s, London had become a city where vast numbers of people lived outside the bounds of respectable society, surviving through various forms of illegal activity or existing on the very margins of legality, with pickpocketing, prostitution, theft, and receiving of stolen goods providing the only means of survival for thousands. It was in this environment, characterized by overcrowding, poverty, inadequate social provision, and limited law enforcement, that Victorian street gangs would establish themselves as a permanent feature of London's underworld, creating criminal organizations which would dominate the city's poorest districts for decades to come. By the time Victoria had been on the throne for a decade, organized criminal gangs were already a recognized problem in London's poorest neighborhoods, though the full extent of their operations and the sophistication of their organization would not become apparent to authorities and the broader public for some years to come. These early formations differed significantly from the casual criminal associations which had existed in previous centuries, when crime was primarily an individual or small group activity carried out opportunistically rather than systematically. The Victorian street gang was characterized by territorial control, with specific streets and districts understood to be under the authority of particular organizations and with boundaries between gang territories being recognized and generally respected by hierarchical organization with clear leadership structures and divisions of labor reminiscent of legitimate businesses, and by specialization in particular forms of crime, with different gangs focusing on different criminal activities according to their expertise, their geographic location, and the opportunities available in their territories. In the rookeries of Seven Dials, the area's dense population and labyrinthine network of narrow alleys and courts provided ideal conditions for criminal activity, as the maze-like street layout allowed criminals to disappear within seconds of committing a theft and made it nearly impossible for pursuing police officers to track them. The streets of Seven Dials were narrow and winding, with many courts and passages which did not appear on any map and which were known only to local residents. Buildings were connected by passages through their cellars and by routes across rooftops, creating multiple escape routes which a criminal familiar with the area could use to evade pursuit. Gangs operating here in the 1840s and 1850s specialized primarily in pickpocketing, targeting the crowds which thronged Covent Garden Market and the surrounding streets, where country farmers and market gardeners brought their produce to sell each morning, and where thousands of Londoners came daily to shop, and where the press of bodies created perfect conditions for skilled thieves to work. Covent Garden Market, which had been established in the 17th century, and which by the Victorian period was one of the largest fruit and vegetable markets in the world, attracted not only legitimate shoppers, but also criminals of all types. The market operated in the early morning hours, with farmers arriving before dawn to set up their stalls, and with buyers coming at first light to select the best produce. The crowds and the focus on commercial transactions created ideal conditions for pickpockets, who could work through the crowds extracting wallets and watches from distracted shoppers and merchants. The market also attracted prostitutes, beggars, and other individuals existing on the margins of society, creating a diverse and chaotic scene in which criminal activity could easily go unnoticed. These operations often involved children, some as young as 6 or 7 years old, who were trained in the techniques of theft from an early age and sent out each day to steal from the pockets and bags of passers-by, returning in the evening to hand over their takings to adult gang members who would reward them with a small share of the proceeds and perhaps a meal. The training of these child thieves was systematic and thorough, replicating in criminal form the apprenticeship system of legitimate trades and providing a form of vocational education which was often more thorough and effective than anything these children could have obtained in the rudimentary schools available to the poor. Young children would begin by observing older thieves at work, watching from doorways and street corners as experienced pickpockets moved through crowds and extracted items from pockets with movements so subtle that even experienced observers might not notice them. They would learn to identify profitable targets, looking for signs of wealth such as quality of clothing, jewelry, or the bulge of a well-filled wallet in a pocket, while also assessing the level of awareness and alertness of potential victims. As an alert person who was conscious of their surroundings was a much more difficult target than someone who was distracted or intoxicated. They would practice on each other, developing the manual dexterity and the confidence necessary for successful theft, with older children teaching younger ones by having them attempt to extract items from pockets without being detected. This practice would continue for months or even years, with the young apprentice thieves gradually improving their skills until they were deemed ready to attempt actual thefts. More experienced thieves would teach them how to pass stolen items to accomplices immediately after a theft, a technique known as passing the swag, which ensured that if the pickpocket were caught, they would not be found in possession of stolen goods, and it would be difficult to prove they had committed a theft. They would learn how to create distractions, with one member of a team bumping into a victim or asking them a question while another performed the actual theft. They would be taught how to behave if confronted by shop assistants or police officers, learning to project innocence and to have plausible explanations ready for their presence in particular locations. Those who showed aptitude would be given increasingly difficult assignments, progressing from stealing handkerchiefs and small items from outer pockets, which required relatively little skill, to extracting wallets and watches from inner pockets or from vest pockets, which required much greater dexterity and nerve, and eventually to cutting watch chains with small sharp blades or picking pockets in situations where the risk of detection was high, but the potential reward was correspondingly greater. The most skilled pickpockets could extract items from almost any pocket or bag without the victim feeling anything, and could work in conditions which less skilled thieves would avoid, such as picking the pocket of someone who was standing still rather than moving through a crowd, or targeting police officers themselves, which some young thieves did as a demonstration of their skill and daring. The East End rookeries harbored their own criminal organizations, distinct from those of the West End, and developing their own particular methods and specializations, which reflected the different economic and social conditions in that part of London. In Whitechapel, gangs established themselves in specific streets and courts, extracting protection money from local shopkeepers and market traders who had little choice but to pay if they wished to continue their businesses unmolested. These protection rackets operated on a systematic basis, with gang members making regular, weekly or monthly visits to businesses within their territory to collect payments. The amounts demanded varied depending on the size and profitability of the business, with larger shops and more prosperous traders being charged more than small stalls and struggling businesses. Shop owners who paid promptly and without complaint received relatively polite treatment, while those who resisted or who failed to pay faced escalating consequences. The Old Nickel, a notorious slum located between Shoreditch and Bethnal Green and consisting of a warren of narrow streets and decaying houses, was home to several gangs, which controlled the area so completely that police officers would only enter in groups of 3 or more, and even then they risked attack from residents who would hurl bottles, bricks, and other missiles from windows and doorways, turning any police incursion into a dangerous undertaking. The district itself covered an area of only a few acres, but it was home to thousands of people living in conditions of extreme poverty and overcrowding. Similar conditions prevailed in Spitalfields, where the decaying houses of former Huguenot silk weavers who had brought prosperity to the area in the 18th century, when Spitalfield silk was famous throughout Europe, had been subdivided into lodging houses occupied by the poorest classes, and where criminal gangs had established complete dominance over the streets. The decline of the silk weaving industry in Spitalfields in the early 19th century, brought about by changes in fashion, competition from cheaper imported silk, and the removal of protective tariffs, had transformed the area from one of relative prosperity to one of poverty. The large houses which had been built for master weavers, with workshops on the upper floors where the looms had been located to take advantage of natural light, were now divided into multiple dwellings housing dozens of families. The workshops, which had once produced fine silk, were now used as living quarters, with entire families occupying spaces which had been designed for looms and which were entirely unsuitable for habitation. South of the Thames, the 40 Thieves maintained their dominance in the Elephant and Castle area, but other gangs had emerged in Bermondsey, Rotherhithe, and along the south bank of the river, areas which had developed rapidly in the early 19th century as the docks expanded to handle the enormous volume of trade flowing through London. These organizations often focused on theft from the docks and warehouses which line the Thames, as well as operating receiving networks for stolen goods, taking advantage of the constant movement of goods through the port to dispose of stolen items which could easily be claimed to be legitimate cargo when they were resold. Dock theft was a major problem throughout the Victorian period, with estimates suggesting that as much as 10% of goods passing through London's docks were stolen, representing losses running into millions of pounds annually. The methods used to steal from the docks were varied and sophisticated. Some dock workers, known as lumpers, were employed to load and unload ships and would pilfer small items which they could conceal on their persons or which they could throw over the dock walls to accomplices waiting outside. Others would adulterate cargoes, adding water to barrels of wine or spirits, or replacing portions of valuable goods with cheaper substitutes, allowing them to steal significant quantities without the theft being immediately apparent. More organized gangs would arrange the theft of entire cargoes, bribing dock officials and foremen to allow goods to be removed without proper documentation, and then transporting the stolen goods to receivers who would integrate them into legitimate commerce. The recruitment of young people into these gangs followed predictable patterns which social reformers and police observers documented extensively in their reports and memoirs. Children born into the rookeries had few opportunities for legitimate employment, as the casual labour market demanded physical strength, which young children lacked, and as the few apprenticeships available were monopolised by those with family connections to particular trades or by those who could afford the premiums which masters charged for taking on apprentices. Many were orphans or came from families too poor to support them, with fathers dead, absent, or unable to find work, and mothers struggling to feed multiple children on earnings from laundry work or other forms of casual female employment, which paid even less than men's labour. A widow with several children to support might earn only a few shillings per week from taking in laundry, an amount which was insufficient to feed and clothe her family forcing her to choose between sending her children to work, regardless of their age, or watching them starve. The gangs offered a form of apprenticeship, teaching criminal skills and providing a share of proceeds in return for participation in thefts and other illegal activities, creating a system which replicated in criminal form the traditional apprenticeship system of legitimate trades. For a child from the rookeries, becoming part of a criminal gang might actually represent an improvement in circumstances, providing regular meals, some sense of community and belonging, and the possibility of earning significant sums of money, far more than could be earned through legitimate child labor such as factory work or chimney sweeping. Boys typically began as lookouts or runners, being posted at street corners to watch for approaching police officers and to carry messages between gang members. Tasks which required reliability and some intelligence, but which did not require particular skills or experience. As they proved themselves trustworthy, they would be given progressively more responsible and more lucrative roles, progressing to more serious crimes as they grew older and demonstrated their reliability and skill. Girls were often employed in shoplifting or as decoys, using their apparent innocence and the Victorian assumption that females were less criminally inclined to gain access to shops and to distract attention while male accomplices committed thefts. The Victorian belief in female moral superiority meant that a young girl would be the last person shop assistants would suspect of theft, and this could be exploited by criminal gangs. Girls might be sent into shops to ask questions or to examine goods, creating a distraction while male gang members stole items from other parts of the shop. Or they might commit thefts themselves, concealing goods in their clothing and leaving the shop before suspicion was aroused. Crime had become organized. These early gangs established clear territorial boundaries, with specific streets or districts understood to be under the control of particular organizations, and with rival gangs generally respecting these boundaries to avoid the violent confrontations which would inevitably attract unwanted police attention and which might result in casualties on both sides and in arrests, which would weaken both gangs. Territorial boundaries were not usually marked in any visible way, but they were well understood by gang members and by residents of the areas in question. A particular street or court might be known to be the territory of a specific gang, and other criminals would generally avoid operating there without permission. These territories might be quite small, consisting of just a few streets or even a single court, or they might extend over several blocks, depending on the strength and influence of the gang in question. Disputes over territory did lead to violent confrontations when one gang attempted to expand into another's domain, or when a particularly lucrative criminal opportunity tempted gangs to cross established boundaries. Though the level of violence in this period remained relatively contained compared to what would develop in later decades when competition intensified and weapons became more readily available, and when the stakes of territorial control increased. Territorial disputes might be resolved through negotiation, with gang leaders meeting to discuss boundaries and to reach agreements about which gang would control which areas. Or they might be resolved through violence, with gangs fighting in the streets to establish dominance. The gangs also developed relationships with receivers of stolen goods, establishing regular business arrangements with certain public houses and shops, which served as locations where thieves could sell their takings, with some receivers becoming wealthy through their role as intermediaries between the criminal underworld and the legitimate economy. Receivers, or fences, as they were commonly known, played a crucial role in the criminal economy of Victorian London. Without receivers, to purchase stolen goods and to convert them back into money or into goods which could be used or resold, theft would have been much less profitable, as thieves would have had to either use the goods themselves or would have had to find individual buyers for each item they stole, a risky and time-consuming process. Receivers provided a reliable market for stolen goods, offering immediate payment, albeit at a fraction of the goods' retail value, and taking on the risk and the work of reselling the goods through legitimate or semi-legitimate channels. Some receivers operated openly from shops, claiming that they were simply purchasing used goods from people who needed money, while others operated more covertly from public houses or from their homes, known only to criminals and to those who needed their services. Consequently, the criminal landscape of London by the mid-19th century was one of established territorial gangs, specialization in particular criminal activities, and increasingly sophisticated methods of operation which demonstrated considerable organizational ability and which suggested that the criminals of Victorian London were not simply desperate individuals acting on impulse, but were members of organized groups which planned their activities and which operated according to established procedures and norms. These early formations would establish patterns of territorial control and criminal specialization that would characterize Victorian gang activity for decades to come, creating a template which later criminal organizations would follow and elaborate upon, and which in some respects persisted into the 20th century and even to the present day. The social circumstances which gave rise to these gangs cannot be separated from the broader political and economic conditions of Victorian Britain. The emergence of Victorian London's street gangs must be considered in light of the profound social inequality and economic deprivation which characterized 19th century Britain, and which seemed to many observers to be an inevitable consequence of industrial capitalism and perhaps even a necessary feature of economic progress. The Industrial Revolution had created enormous wealth for factory owners, merchants, and the landowning classes, who saw their incomes and assets multiply exponentially as Britain became the workshop of the world and as the British Empire expanded to encompass a quarter of the world's land surface and population. But the benefits of this prosperity were not shared equally across society, and indeed, the gap between rich and poor seemed to be widening rather than narrowing as the century progressed. The majority of London's working population lived in conditions of extreme poverty, with wages barely sufficient to cover the cost of food and shelter, and with no margin for savings or for weathering periods of unemployment or illness, which were inevitable features of life for the working poor. Contemporary observers were shocked by the extent of urban destitution which they encountered in the poorest districts of London, and many wrote detailed accounts attempting to convey to middle-class readers, most of whom had never ventured into the slums and who had no direct experience of poverty, the conditions in which the poor lived, and the moral and physical degradation which they witnessed. In 1851, Henry Mayhew, a journalist and social researcher who spent years documenting the lives of London's working poor through direct observation and hundreds of interviews, published his extensive survey London Labour and the London Poor, which documented the lives of the capital's poorest inhabitants in unprecedented detail through accounts of street traders, labourers, prostitutes, and criminals whom he interviewed at length, allowing them to tell their stories in their own words. Mayhew's work ran to several volumes and included detailed descriptions of the various occupations of the London poor, from costermongers selling fruit and vegetables from barrows to crossing sweepers who cleared paths through the mud and horse dung of London's streets for a few pennies. Mayhew estimated that approximately 1 in 8 Londoners survived through some form of criminal activity, whether pickpocketing, prostitution, theft, or the receiving of stolen goods, suggesting that the criminal class numbered well over 300,000 people in a city whose total population was approaching 3 million by the 1850s. This estimate was probably conservative, as Mayhew himself acknowledged that many forms of petty crime were so common and so accepted in the poorest communities that they were barely considered criminal by those who engaged in them, such as taking coal that had fallen from carts, pilfering small items from unattended market stalls, or children stealing food when they were hungry. His work revealed a vast underclass existing entirely outside respectable society, living in lodging houses which charged 4p per night for a shared bed, where strangers slept together in rooms containing dozens of beds with no privacy and no security for what few possessions they had, or 2p to sleep sitting upright on a bench in the common room of a lodging house, or sleeping rough in the streets when even that small sum could not be raised, finding shelter in doorways, under arches, or in any protected spot where they might avoid the worst of the weather. These individuals survived through whatever means presented themselves and had no prospect of ever rising into respectable employment, as they lacked the clothes, the education, the references, and the connections which would have been necessary to obtain even the most menial legitimate employment. A person who had been sleeping rough for weeks or months would be dirty, ragged, and probably infested with lice, making them entirely unsuitable for employment in any respectable establishment. Even if they managed to find work, they would need money to pay for lodging while they waited for their first wages, and they would need to maintain themselves during any periods when work was not available, which for casual labourers might mean several days per week. The result was a cycle of destitution from which escape was nearly impossible without outside assistance. The workhouse system, established under the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, was intended to provide relief for the destitute while discouraging dependency on public assistance by making the experience of receiving relief so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would seek it, embodying the principle of less eligibility, which held that relief should be provided at a level which was less desirable than the lowest paid labour available in the free market. Conditions in workhouses were deliberately harsh, designed by their architects and by the Poor Law Commissioners who oversaw the system to ensure that only the truly desperate would seek admission and that those who did enter would be motivated to leave and find employment as quickly as possible. Families were separated upon entry with husbands sent to one section of the workhouse, wives to another, and children to a third, so that families might not see each other for weeks or months, despite being under the same roof. A policy which was intended to discourage married couples from seeking relief, but which caused enormous suffering, particularly to mothers who were separated from their young children. Inmates were required to perform tedious and often pointless labor, such as picking oakum, the process of unraveling old rope fibers using one's fingernails to separate the strands, which would then be sold for caulking ships, work which was painful, monotonous, and which left the hands bloody and raw, or breaking rocks into gravel which would be used for road construction, or other forms of hard labor which had no purpose beyond occupying the inmate's time and making the workhouse experience as unpleasant as possible. The food provided was kept to a bare minimum, necessary to sustain life, typically consisting of bread, gruel made from oatmeal and water, and occasionally some cheese or meat, but always in quantities which left the inmates hungry and which were calculated to provide just enough nutrition to prevent starvation, while ensuring that no one would voluntarily remain in the workhouse if they had any alternative. The social stigma attached to entering the workhouse was so great that many preferred to risk starvation or turn to crime rather than submit to its regime, viewing the workhouse as a form of prison for the poor and fearing that once inside they might never be released, or that the experience would break their spirit and their health. The workhouse represented the ultimate degradation for a working-class person, an admission that they had failed to support themselves and their families, and that they had become dependent on public charity. For a man who had prided himself on supporting his family through his own labor, entering the workhouse meant admitting defeat and subjecting himself and his family to a harsh and degrading regime. As a result, the workhouse system did little to alleviate the poverty which drove many into criminal activity, and indeed may have contributed to criminality by destroying family structures which might have provided support, and by teaching those who passed through its doors that society had no care for their welfare, and that they could expect nothing from the state except punishment for their poverty. Child labour was widespread throughout Victorian Britain, with hundreds of thousands of children employed in occupations which would shock modern sensibilities and which contemporary reformers described in horrifying detail in parliamentary reports and in the popular press. Children as young as 5 or 6 were employed in factories, particularly in textile mills, where their small size allowed them to crawl under machinery to retrieve dropped threads or to clean mechanisms which were too small for adult workers to access, working 12 to 16 hours per day in dangerous conditions for minimal wages, which might be as little as a shilling or 2 per week, often performing tasks which required small hands and bodies, such as crawling through narrow mine shafts to open and close ventilation doors, or reaching into moving machinery to adjust threads or to remove obstructions, work which frequently resulted in serious injuries, including crushed limbs, severed fingers, and deaths from being caught in machinery. The Factory Acts, beginning with legislation in 1833, which limited the hours which children could work and which required that child workers receive some basic education, and gradually expanded throughout the Victorian period with additional acts in 1844, 1847, 1850 and subsequent years imposed some restrictions on child labor and attempted to ameliorate the worst abuses, limiting the hours which children could work according to their age, requiring that young workers receive some basic education for a few hours per week, and prohibiting the employment of children below certain ages in particularly dangerous occupations such as mining. However, enforcement was weak, and many employers simply ignored the regulations, knowing that the factory inspectors employed by the government were few in number, and that their districts were so large that any given factory might be inspected only once every few years, if at all, and that desperate parents would allow their children to work illegally rather than see them starve, and indeed would often lie about their children's ages to allow them to work when they were below the legal minimum age. Employers who were caught violating the Factory Acts faced only small fines, which were rarely large enough to serve as an effective deterrent, and prosecutions were infrequent. Education was not compulsory until the Elementary Education Act of 1870, which established a framework for universal elementary education, and which, for the first time, made education compulsory for children between the ages of 5 and 13, and even then, many poor families could not afford to send their children to school, as they needed every child old enough to work contributing to the household income, and as the loss of even a few shillings per week in potential earnings could mean the difference between survival and destitution for a family living on the edge of poverty. Even after education became compulsory and free in 1891, attendance was often poor in the poorest districts, as families continued to rely on children's earnings and as enforcement of attendance requirements was inconsistent. Schools in the poorest districts were often overcrowded and understaffed, with a single teacher attempting to manage classrooms of 50 or 60 children of various ages and abilities, making effective education nearly impossible. This lack of education meant that thousands of children grew up illiterate and without legitimate employment prospects, as the better paid jobs in offices, shops, and skilled trades required at minimum the ability to read, write, and perform basic arithmetic, skills which the children of the poor rarely acquired. A child who had never attended school or who had attended only irregularly would reach adolescence unable to read or write, closing off virtually all paths to respectable employment and leaving only unskilled casual labor or crime as means of survival. For many, involvement in criminal gangs offered the only available form of apprenticeship and training, teaching skills which, while illegal at least, provided the possibility of earning a living, and indeed of earning far more than could be made through legitimate labor, as a successful pickpocket or burglar could earn in a single day what a factory worker might earn in a week or a month. The gangs provided structure, income, and a form of community for children who might otherwise have starved or been forced into the workhouse, creating a criminal class which was largely self-perpetuating as each generation trained the next in methods of theft and deception. Contemporary social theorists developed the concept of a hereditary criminal class, believing that criminality was passed down through families and that certain groups were inherently disposed toward lawlessness, with criminal tendencies thought to be as much a matter of biology and breeding as of social circumstances, an idea which drew on emerging theories about heredity and degeneration. This theory, though now thoroughly discredited by modern sociology and criminology, which recognize that criminal behavior is primarily a product of social conditions rather than inherited characteristics, was widely accepted among Victorian reformers and policymakers, and it shaped responses to crime throughout the period. Influential figures such as Henry Mayhew divided the poor into the deserving poor, who are victims of circumstances beyond their control, and who, with assistance, might rise into respectability, and the undeserving poor, or criminal class, who were thought to be morally degraded and perhaps biologically inferior, incapable of improvement, and representing a permanent threat to social order. It was believed that the rookeries bred crime, with successive generations learning criminal behavior from their parents and neighbors, and with entire families existing in a state of moral degradation from which it was impossible to escape without removing them from the corrupting influence of their environment. Children raised in criminal families, it was thought, would inevitably become criminals themselves, as they would learn criminal skills and criminal values from earliest childhood and would have no exposure to respectable society or to legitimate means of earning a living. Some reformers argued for the wholesale demolition of slum districts, believing that the physical environment itself promoted vice and that only by destroying the rookeries and dispersing their populations to other areas or to purpose-built model housing could the criminal class be broken up and the cycle of poverty and crime be interrupted. However, when such clearances did occur, they typically displaced the poor without providing alternative housing or addressing the underlying causes of poverty, simply moving the problem elsewhere and often making conditions worse by reducing the already inadequate housing stock available to the poorest. As the clearances destroyed thousands of dwellings, while the new housing which was built to replace them was typically too expensive for the former residents to afford, being aimed at the respectable working class rather than at the very poorest. The absence of an effective police force for much of the early Victorian period exacerbated these problems considerably and created conditions in which criminal gangs could operate with relative impunity. The Metropolitan Police, established by Sir Robert Peel in 1829 in response to growing concerns about crime and disorder in the capital, and in an attempt to create a professional, disciplined police force modelled on military lines, initially numbered fewer than 3,000 officers for a city of over 1.5 million people, providing a ratio of police to population of approximately 1 officer for every 500 residents, which was woefully inadequate for effective law enforcement, particularly in the poorest districts where crime was most prevalent and where the need for police presence was greatest. The force expanded gradually over subsequent decades, with recruitment occurring steadily as the budget allowed and as the need for additional officers became apparent, reaching approximately 8,000 officers by 1850 and over 13,000 by 1880. But even these numbers were inadequate for effective policing of the poorest districts where gangs operated, as officers were thinly spread across the entire metropolis, which by this time covered an area of many square miles, and as many were deployed in the wealthier areas where their presence was demanded by influential residents and ratepayers who had the political power to insist on adequate police protection for their property. The Metropolitan Police was organized into divisions, each covering a specific geographic area of London, and each commanded by a superintendent, with the divisions subdivided into sections commanded by inspectors and further divided into beats patrolled by individual constables. Each constable was assigned a specific route which he was expected to patrol at a regular pace, passing particular points at predictable times so that residents would know when to expect the constable to pass and could call for assistance if needed. This system, while providing comprehensive coverage of most of London, had the disadvantage of making police movements predictable, allowing criminals to time their activities to avoid periods when the constable would be passing. In the poorest and most dangerous districts, constables often patrolled in pairs or groups for their own safety, which reduced the area which could be covered and created gaps in police coverage which criminals could exploit. Moreover, the relationship between the police and the communities they were meant to serve was often antagonistic rather than cooperative, which severely hampered police efforts to combat gang crime, and which meant that police were often operating in hostile territory, where local residents viewed them as enemies rather than as protectors. Officers, known as peelers or bobbies, after their founder Sir Robert Peel, were viewed with suspicion and hostility in many working-class areas, where they were seen not as protectors, but as enforcers of laws which criminalized activities many poor people relied upon for survival and which seemed designed to control and oppress the poor rather than to protect them from genuine crime. In the rookeries, police patrols were frequently met with violence, and officers learned to avoid certain streets and courts where gangs held complete control and where they risked serious injury or even death if they ventured in alone or in small numbers. Residents of these areas had no tradition of cooperating with police, and indeed had every reason to view the police as enemies, as officers arrested people for offences such as street trading without a license, which many poor people depended on for survival, but which required payment of fees which the poorest could not afford, obstructing the pavement while selling goods, or simply standing in groups, or being drunk and disorderly, which in practice meant that working-class men could be arrested for public drunkenness, while middle-class men engaging in similar behavior in private clubs or restaurants were left alone. Police also enforced public order laws, which restricted gatherings and demonstrations, breaking up political meetings and labor union organizing activities, which the state viewed as potential threats to public order and to the interests of employers, making police appear to working-class people as agents of class oppression rather than as neutral enforcers of law. The Chartist movement of the 1830s and 1840s, which sought to secure political rights for working men through petitions and demonstrations, was suppressed by police and military force, creating lasting resentment against police among politically conscious workers. Trade union meetings were frequently broken up by police on the grounds that they constituted unlawful assemblies, and union organizers were arrested and prosecuted. As a result, police were frequently met with resistance and non-cooperation from local populations who saw them as enemies rather than as allies in combating crime, with witnesses refusing to provide information about crimes they had witnessed, victims declining to report offences for fear that police attention would bring other problems down upon them, such as investigation of their own activities, which might not be entirely legal. and juries in criminal trials sometimes acquitting defendants despite clear evidence of guilt because they sympathized with the accused and distrusted the police, or because they objected to the laws which were being enforced. The detective branch, established in 1842, with just 8 officers attached to Scotland Yard, and given the responsibility of investigating serious crimes across all of London, was intended to provide a more sophisticated approach to criminal investigation than the uniformed patrol officers could offer, allowing for undercover work, surveillance, and the development of informants. But this small unit was hopelessly inadequate for the task it had been set, given the scale of crime in London and the sophistication of criminal organizations. It was reorganized and expanded into the Criminal Investigation Department in 1878, at which point it numbered approximately 200 detectives assigned to investigate crime across all of London, with these officers divided among the various police divisions which covered different geographic areas of the metropolis and reporting to divisional superintendents who coordinated detective work in their areas. Yet even with this expansion, resources dedicated to investigating organized crime remained limited, as the CID was forced to respond to individual cases as they arose, investigating murders, serious assaults, major thefts, and other crimes which demanded immediate attention, rather than conducting the kind of systematic, long-term investigations of criminal organizations which would be necessary to dismantle gang structures and to arrest and prosecute gang leaders who were careful to insulate themselves from direct involvement in criminal acts. Detectives were overwhelmed with cases and had neither the time nor the resources to conduct the surveillance, gather the intelligence, build relationships with informants, and construct the comprehensive cases which would be necessary to secure convictions against gang leaders who ensured that any illegal activities could not be traced directly to them, and who used intermediaries and frontmen to insulate themselves from prosecution. A detective might be working on a dozen cases simultaneously, responding to new crimes as they occurred while trying to maintain progress on existing investigations, making it impossible to devote the sustained attention which would be necessary to investigate complex criminal organizations. Moreover, detectives faced the same problems of community non-cooperation which patrol officers encountered, with witnesses refusing to provide information, and with gang members maintaining strict codes of silence which made it difficult to gather evidence or to recruit informants from within gang organizations. Corruption within the Metropolitan Police, while not as widespread as in some other major cities such as New York, where police corruption was endemic and where entire precincts were effectively on the payroll of criminal organizations, and where promotion depended more on political connections and ability to generate corrupt income than on merit or effectiveness, was nonetheless a significant problem which undermined efforts to combat gang crime and which created cynicism among honest officers who saw corrupt colleagues profiting from their positions while they struggled on inadequate salaries. Some officers accepted bribes from criminals in return for ignoring illegal activities or for providing warnings of planned raids, allowing gangs to relocate their operations, or to ensure that when police arrived, there would be no evidence to seize and no suspects to arrest, with the officers receiving regular payments which might amount to more than their official salaries. Others maintained relationships with receivers of stolen goods, taking a percentage of profits in return for their protection, and effectively becoming business partners with the criminals they were supposed to be arresting, with some officers even helping receivers to find buyers for particularly valuable stolen items, and thus becoming active participants in the stolen goods market rather than simply passive recipients of bribes. The most corrupt officers were effectively on the payroll of major criminal organizations, providing them with intelligence about police operations, warning them when investigations were focusing on their activities, informing them of the identities of informants who were providing information to police, and in some cases, actively sabotaging investigations by losing evidence, intimidating witnesses, or providing false information which directed investigations away from the real criminals and toward innocent parties or toward minor figures whose arrest would not significantly damage the gang's operations. These corrupt officers were protected by networks of colleagues who either benefited from the corruption themselves or who adhered to an informal code which held that officers should not inform on each other, making it difficult for honest officers to report corruption without facing retaliation from corrupt colleagues and without risking being ostracized by their fellow officers. The court system presented additional challenges to prosecuting gang members successfully, even when police managed to gather sufficient evidence to bring charges and to identify and arrest suspects. Witnesses were frequently intimidated into refusing to testify or into changing their statements to remove any incriminating details, with gang members or their associates visiting witnesses before trials to make clear what would happen to them or to their families if they testified against gang members. These intimidation efforts might take the form of explicit threats of violence or might be more subtle, with gang members simply letting witnesses know that they knew where the witness lived, where their children went to school, and that the gang had a long memory. Gang members would attend trials in numbers, filling the public gallery and creating an atmosphere of menace in courtrooms as they glared at witnesses and jurors, making silent threats through their presence alone and making clear that anyone who testified or voted to convict would face consequences once the trial was over and police protection was withdrawn. Some witnesses were attacked before trials, being beaten in their homes or on the street as warnings to themselves and to others who might consider testifying, with the beatings administered in ways which made clear that this was retaliation for cooperation with authorities rather than simply random violence. Others were threatened with reprisals against their families, with threats to harm children being particularly effective in silencing potential witnesses who might have been willing to risk harm to themselves, but who could not bear to endanger their children or elderly relatives. Magistrates and judges were aware of these problems, and some made efforts to address them by allowing witnesses to testify behind screens which concealed their identity from the public gallery, or by keeping witness identities confidential until the last possible moment, or by providing police protection for witnesses during trials. But they had limited means to protect witnesses from retaliation after trials concluded, when police protection would be withdrawn and witnesses would return to their homes, which were often in the same neighborhoods as the gang members they had testified against. And many witnesses concluded Their cooperation with authorities simply was not worth the risk to themselves and their families. Moreover, the burden of proof required for conviction in criminal trials meant that many gang members walked free despite strong suspicions of their involvement in crimes and despite police being convinced of their guilt, as without reliable witness testimony or physical evidence linking the suspect directly to the crime, prosecutors struggled to secure convictions. English law required proof beyond reasonable doubt before a conviction could be secured, a high standard which was designed to protect the innocent, but which, in practice, often resulted in guilty parties escaping punishment. Gang members learned to exploit weaknesses in the legal system, using false identities to avoid having previous convictions considered in sentencing, so that they could appear before judges as first-time offenders deserving of mercy, when in fact they had long criminal records under other names, claiming to be first-time offenders, when in fact they had long criminal records accumulated under different names in different jurisdictions, and employing lawyers who were skilled in finding procedural irregularities which could be used to challenge the admissibility of evidence or to have cases dismissed on technical grounds, questioning the reliability of police testimony and suggesting that evidence had been planted or fabricated, and arguing that the prosecution had not proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, even when the evidence seemed overwhelming to observers. Some gang members became so familiar with court procedures from their repeated appearances that they effectively became amateur lawyers, knowing which arguments were likely to succeed and which judges were more or less sympathetic to defendants, coaching other gang members on how to conduct themselves during trials to maximize their chances of acquittal or of receiving lenient sentences, advising them to dress respectably, to appear remorseful, to show respect to the judge, and to present themselves as victims of circumstances rather than as hardened criminals. They learned to identify sympathetic jurors during jury selection and to play on their sympathies during testimony, and they understood how to exploit disagreements among jurors to achieve hung juries, which would result in mistrials and possible acquittals. Despite such efforts to combat gang activity through increased police numbers, detective work, and prosecutions, the police response struggled to keep pace with the scale and organization of Victorian criminal operations throughout much of the 19th century, with gangs adapting to police tactics more quickly than police could adapt to gang methods and finding new methods of operation whenever old methods became too risky, or when police developed effective countermeasures. To counteract the risk of prosecution, many gang members sought to cultivate public support within their local communities, presenting themselves as defenders of the poor rather than as exploiters and predators, creating a public image which made it more difficult for police to operate in gang-controlled territories. Among the first and most notorious of these criminal organizations to develop such sophisticated operations were the gangs operating in the Elephant and Castle district of South London, where the 40 Thieves continued to refine their methods and to expand their influence. By the 1870s, the gang, which would become known as the 40 Elephants, had established itself as the most sophisticated shoplifting operation in London, and indeed perhaps in all of Britain, with operations which demonstrated a level of organization and professionalism which would not have seemed out of place in a legitimate business enterprise. The organization, which had operated under various names since at least the 1820s and which derived its later name from its base in the Elephant and Castle district, specialized in what was known in criminal circles as hoisting, the theft of high-value goods from shops and department stores, a form of crime which required considerable skill, nerve, and organization to carry out successfully on a large scale, and which could generate enormous profits with relatively low risk compared to more violent forms of crime. The gang's methods were elaborate and demonstrated a level of planning and coordination which rivaled that of legitimate businesses and which required careful attention to detail and extensive preparation. Female members would dress in expensive clothing, presenting themselves as wealthy ladies of leisure who were entirely above suspicion and who would naturally be expected to be shopping in the finest establishments. And this clothing was often specially tailored by dressmakers who were either members of the gang or who were paid well for their services and their silence, and who understood exactly what was required without needing explicit instructions. The garments featured hidden pockets sewn into the lining, cleverly concealed so that they would not be apparent to casual inspection, extra large sleeves which could conceal bottles or small boxes without creating any unusual bulge or affecting the drape of the garment, and concealed compartments sewn into petticoats and undergarments, which could hold considerable quantities of fabric, lace, or jewelry while remaining completely invisible from outside. These modifications were so cunningly designed that even a close inspection might not reveal their presence, unless the examiner knew exactly what to look for and where to look. And they allowed the women to conceal stolen goods worth tens or even hundreds of pounds on their persons without creating any visible bulk or awkwardness in their movements or any change in their silhouette which might attract suspicion. Some garments featured false hems which could hold jewelry or other small valuable items, while others had special corsets with built-in pockets. The dressmakers who created these specialized garments became skilled at their craft, developing innovations and improvements which made the garments ever more effective at concealing stolen goods while remaining comfortable to wear and natural in appearance. These dressmakers charged substantial fees for their services, but the investment was worthwhile for the gang as the specialized clothing was essential to their operations and allowed them to steal goods worth far more than could be concealed in ordinary clothing. The women would travel in small groups to the West End, often taking omnibuses, which provided cheap public transport throughout London, or later in the period, the Underground Railway, which had been extended to serve South London, mingling with genuine shoppers on their journey and conducting themselves with such assurance and apparent respectability that no one would suspect their true purpose or imagine that these elegantly dressed ladies were professional thieves. They targeted the department stores which were transforming London's retail landscape in the Victorian period, establishments such as Swan and Edgar on Piccadilly Circus, which had been established in 1812 and had grown to become one of London's premier drapers, selling fine fabrics and fashionable clothing. Whiteley's in Bayswater, founded in 1863 by William Whiteley, who styled himself the universal provider and who aimed to sell everything from groceries to furniture under one roof in what was claimed to be the world's first department store. and Peter Robinson on Oxford Street, which specialized in morning wear and fashionable dress, and which attracted a wealthy clientele. These large stores, with their multiple departments spread across several floors and numerous staff members who could not possibly keep track of all customers and all merchandise at all times, provided ideal conditions for organized shoplifting. As the constant flow of customers and the sheer size of the establishments meant that shop assistants were overwhelmed with legitimate customers and had little ability to monitor for theft. The stores employed a limited number of floorwalkers whose job was to watch for suspicious behavior, but these employees could not be everywhere at once, and experienced shoplifters could easily identify them and avoid their attention. Moreover, the store's emphasis on customer service and their policy of allowing customers to browse and to handle merchandise without pressure to purchase meant that it was difficult for staff to distinguish between a legitimate customer examining goods with the intention of purchasing and a thief examining goods with the intention of stealing them. The technique employed by the 40 elephants required considerable skill and nerves of steel, as even the slightest mistake or moment of carelessness could result in detection and arrest. Members would enter a shop during busy periods when staff attention was divided among multiple customers, and when the press of shoppers provided cover for their activities and made it difficult for any individual customer to be closely monitored. They typically operated on Saturday afternoons when stores were busiest, or during sales when the crowds were largest and when staff were most overwhelmed. One woman, typically the most accomplished actress in the group, and often one of the gang's leaders or most experienced members, would engage a shop assistant in conversation, requesting to see various items and asking detailed questions about their quality, origin, price, and comparing them to similar items from competitors, keeping the assistant occupied for as long as possible while appearing to be a serious potential customer who might make a substantial purchase and who therefore deserved the assistant's full attention and best service. She would ask to see items from high shelves, requiring the assistant to use ladders or to fetch them from stockrooms, creating periods when the assistant was distracted and not watching the merchandise which had already been brought out. She might ask about items which were not currently in stock, sending the assistant to check with managers or to look in stockrooms. Or she might request special services such as alterations or gift wrapping, all tactics designed to keep the assistant occupied and distracted for as long as possible. Meanwhile, her associates would move through other parts of the shop, selecting valuable items and concealing them in their specially designed clothing with movements so practiced and subtle that even other customers standing nearby would notice nothing amiss and would see only well-dressed ladies examining merchandise as any customer might do. The stolen items would be concealed in the elaborate pockets and compartments of their clothing with smooth, practiced movements which appeared entirely natural, and the group would then leave the shop separately rather than together, exiting at intervals of several minutes to avoid any appearance of association and to reduce the risk that if one member was stopped and searched, the others would also be detained. Each woman would take a different route back to South London, with some taking omnibuses, others walking, and still others taking the Underground Railway, so that if one was stopped and searched, the others would not be implicated and would have time to dispose of their stolen goods before they could be apprehended. The gang had contingency plans for various scenarios, including pre-arranged meeting points where members could regroup if they became separated, and signals which could be used to warn other members if police or store detectives were nearby. Before long, the 40 Elephants had developed an extensive network for disposing of stolen goods, which was nearly as sophisticated as their theft operations, and which was essential to the profitability of their activities, as stolen goods were worthless until they could be converted into cash or into goods which could be used or traded. Working in association with receivers operating in South London, particularly in the Elephant and Castle area and in nearby Walworth and Kennington, the gang could quickly convert stolen merchandise into cash, typically receiving between 1/4 and 1/3 of the retail value of the goods, which, while a substantial discount, still provided considerable profit, given that the goods had cost them nothing to acquire except the risk and effort of stealing them. A dress which sold for £10 in a West End shop might bring £2 or £3 from a receiver, which, while a significant loss, still represented pure profit, as the dress had cost nothing, and a successful shoplifting expedition might net a gang member £10 or £20 in a single day, more than most working-class women could earn in months of legitimate labour. These receivers, often operating from public houses or small shops which served as fronts for their illegal businesses, would purchase the goods with few questions asked beyond ensuring that the items were of the quality and type which had been promised, and that they had not been marked or damaged in ways which would make them difficult to resell. The receivers then sold them on through various channels which had been established over years of operation, and which involved extensive networks of contacts throughout London and beyond. Some goods were sold to market traders who operated in the street markets which existed throughout London and who asked no questions about the provenance of merchandise they purchased, as long as the price was right and the goods were of acceptable quality. These market traders might sell the stolen goods at prices below those charged in legitimate shops, attracting customers who were either unaware that the goods were stolen or who chose not to ask questions about origins of merchandise, which seemed suspiciously cheap. Other items were transported out of London entirely and sold in provincial towns and cities where there was less risk of the stolen nature of the goods being discovered, as a silk dress stolen from a London shop was unlikely to be recognised when it appeared for sale in Manchester or Birmingham, or in smaller towns where the latest London fashions were eagerly sought by local gentry and merchants who wanted to appear fashionable but who had limited access to London's shops. The receivers maintained contacts with traders in provincial markets and with shopkeepers throughout the country who were willing to purchase goods of uncertain provenance at prices below wholesale, asking no questions and maintaining plausible deniability about the origins of their stock. Still other items, particularly jewellery and other high-value goods, which could be easily identified by markings or unusual characteristics, might be broken up or melted down to disguise their origin before being sold as raw materials or as new items made from the melted metal or reset stones. The organisation was unusual among Victorian criminal gangs in that it was predominantly female, with women occupying not only the frontline theft positions, but also many of the leadership and organizational roles, making decisions about targets, methods, division of proceeds, and recruitment of new members. While most street gangs of the period were male-dominated, with women playing only supporting roles if they were involved at all, perhaps as lookouts or as couriers, but rarely as thieves or leaders. The 40 Elephants recognized that women could enter shops and handle merchandise without attracting the same level of suspicion as men, as Victorian gender conventions held that shopping was a feminine activity and that a well-dressed woman examining silk, lace, or jewelry was simply exercising the natural female interest in personal adornment and fashion, which was considered appropriate and even expected for women of the middle and upper classes. A man showing interest in ladies' goods would immediately attract suspicion from shop staff, who would wonder what use a gentleman could have for ladies' clothing or accessories, and who would watch him carefully to ensure he was not stealing or engaging in other inappropriate behavior. By contrast, a woman examining such goods was behaving exactly as expected and would be treated with courtesy and given space to browse freely, creating ideal conditions for theft. This gendered division of labor gave the 40 Elephants a considerable advantage in the specific criminal niche they had chosen to exploit, and the gang maintained this advantage carefully, ensuring that their members always presented themselves as respectable ladies and never engaging in behavior which might undermine this carefully cultivated image. However, the gang maintained close relationships with male criminal organizations in South London, particularly the Elephant and Castle Boys, who were a more traditional male gang engaged in protection rackets, violent robbery, and other crimes which required physical intimidation and violence, rather than the subtlety and deception which characterized the 40 Elephants' operations. These associations provided protection and muscle when needed, ensuring that receivers paid promptly for goods they had agreed to purchase, and did not try to cheat the gang by offering less than the agreed price, or by claiming that goods were of lower quality than they actually were, settling disputes with rival gangs who might attempt to encroach on the 40 Elephants' territory or to interfere with their operations, and providing physical security for gang members and their families who might otherwise be vulnerable to retaliation from shop owners, police, or rival criminals. There is evidence that some of the male gang members were married to or related to women in the 40 Elephants, creating family networks which linked the various criminal organizations operating in South London, and which ensured a degree of cooperation and coordination between gangs which might otherwise have been rivals competing for the same criminal opportunities. These family connections created bonds of loyalty which transcended individual gang affiliations, and which helped to maintain peace between different criminal organizations in South London. The two organizations operated in a symbiotic relationship, with each providing services and support to the other, creating a criminal network which was more powerful and resilient than either organization would have been operating alone, and which could coordinate activities and share intelligence about police operations and about opportunities for profit. By the 1880s, the scale of the 40 Elephants' operations had expanded considerably as the gang recruited new members to replace those who had retired or been arrested and refined its methods to take advantage of the continued growth of London's retail sector and the proliferation of new department stores offering ever more tempting targets for theft. The gang's recruitment was selective, with potential members being carefully vetted to ensure they had the necessary skills, reliability, and discretion, and new recruits undergoing extensive training before being allowed to participate in actual thefts. Court records from the period indicate that individual members arrested for shoplifting were often found to be carrying goods valued at £10 to £20, a substantial sum when the average working class weekly wage was approximately £1, and when many families survived on considerably less, with unskilled labourers earning perhaps 15 shillings per week, and women in sweated trades earning as little as 5 or 6 shillings for a full week's work. A theft of goods worth £20 represented, therefore, approximately 5 months' wages for a skilled workman, or perhaps a year's wages for a woman working as a seamstress or laundress, and successful members of the 40 Elephants could earn such sums in a single afternoon of shoplifting, making it enormously more profitable than any form of legitimate work available to working-class women. The total value of goods stolen by the gang as a whole was estimated by police to amount to thousands of pounds annually, though the true figure was likely much higher, given that many thefts went undetected, and that even when losses were discovered, shop managers often chose not to report them to police, rather than admit that their security measures had been inadequate or face the embarrassment of having been victimized by thieves, preferring to write off the losses as part of the cost of doing business. The gang also developed sophisticated methods to evade prosecution, even when members were arrested, which happened with some frequency given the scale of their operations, and the fact that even the most careful thieves occasionally made mistakes or had bad luck. Members used false names and addresses when arrested, giving the names of acquaintances who would deny knowing them or entirely fictional persons, and claiming to live at addresses which did not exist or which belonged to people who would deny all knowledge of them when police investigated, making it difficult for police to track their criminal records and to establish patterns of repeated offending which would justify harsher sentences. They employed lawyers who specialized in defending shoplifting cases and who were skilled at exploiting technicalities in the legal process, challenging the identification of stolen goods by arguing that the items found on the defendant could not be definitively proven to be the same items which had been stolen from the shop, questioning the reliability of witness testimony by suggesting that shop assistants might be mistaken in their identification or might be lying to avoid being blamed for the theft themselves, and arguing that the evidence was insufficient to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt, even when the facts seemed clear to observers. Some members were claimed to be pregnant when arrested, which often resulted in more lenient treatment from magistrates who were reluctant to sentence expectant mothers to imprisonment, particularly to hard labor, which was the standard sentence for theft, fearing that imprisonment might harm the unborn child or cause a miscarriage for which they might be held morally responsible, though in many cases these claims were false and were simply a tactic to avoid punishment or to secure a lighter sentence. Others would dress in mourning clothes and claim to be grieving widows who had been driven to theft by desperation after losing their husbands and being left without means of support, playing on Victorian sentimentality about widowhood and motherhood to win sympathy from judges and juries who might be inclined to show mercy to a woman who appeared to have fallen on hard times through no fault of her own, and who seemed to be a victim of circumstances rather than a hardened criminal. The gang developed detailed knowledge of the legal system and of the personalities and tendencies of different magistrates and judges, knowing which were more sympathetic to female defendants and which were harsh, which were likely to accept particular types of excuses or explanations and which would dismiss them, and timing their court appearances when possible to appear before sympathetic magistrates who might be more inclined to show mercy. They also understood the importance of appearing respectable in court, and members who were arrested would be provided with clean, respectable clothing to wear to their hearings, creating an impression of respectability, which contrasted with the squalid conditions of their actual lives and which suggested to magistrates that they were not members of the criminal class, but rather respectable women who had made a single mistake or who had been driven to theft by temporary desperation. The 40 Elephants operations continued to expand throughout the late Victorian period, with the gang becoming increasingly bold and sophisticated in its methods and reaching the peak of its power and influence. But they were far from the only criminal organization operating in London, and in the East End very different types of gangs were emerging which specialized in violence rather than in deception. The East End of London, with its dense immigrant population and grinding poverty, became home to some of Victorian London's most violent street gangs, organizations which differed significantly from the relatively non-violent shoplifting operations of the 40 Elephants, and which created conditions of terror and intimidation in the districts where they operated. The districts of Whitechapel, Bethnal Green, Spitalfields, and Stepney, located to the east of the City of London and stretching toward the expanding docks along the Thames, which handled the vast majority of London's maritime trade, had absorbed successive waves of migrants throughout the 19th century, creating a patchwork of communities divided by ethnicity, language, and religion, and often competing with each other for scarce resources such as work, housing, and territory, creating tensions which occasionally erupted into violence between different ethnic groups. Irish immigration in the 1840s and 1850s, driven by the Great Famine which devastated Ireland between 1845 and 1852, and which was caused by the failure of the potato crop on which the Irish peasantry depended almost entirely for subsistence, and which killed approximately 1 million people while forcing another million to emigrate to Britain, America, and other destinations, had brought tens of thousands of desperate refugees to London seeking any opportunity for survival. These Irish migrants settled primarily in the poorest districts where housing was cheapest and where landlords asked few questions, often occupying the most dilapidated buildings which English tenants refused to rent, and where they faced considerable hostility from English workers who resented the competition for jobs and who blamed the Irish for driving down wages by accepting work at rates below what English labourers would demand and for filling positions which English workers felt should be reserved for them. The Irish community in the East End established its own social networks and institutions, with Irish public houses where Irish workers could drink and socialise away from the hostility of English pubs. Catholic churches which served the Irish Catholic population in a country which was predominantly Protestant and where anti-Catholic prejudice was widespread, and mutual aid societies which provided support to Irish families in times of illness or unemployment, creating a community structure which provided some security and support, but which also reinforced the isolation of the Irish from the broader English population and contributed to ethnic tensions. The Irish were frequently stereotyped in English popular culture as drunken, violent, and primitive, and faced discrimination in employment and housing, which forced many into the worst jobs and the worst living conditions. This had been followed by Jewish immigration from Russia and Eastern Europe beginning in the 1880s, as Jews fled pogroms and persecution, which had intensified following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, with subsequent Russian governments encouraging anti-Semitic violence as a means of directing popular anger away from the state itself and as a way of deflecting criticism of government policies and economic problems by providing a scapegoat in the form of the Jewish minority. The assassination of Alexander II had been carried out by revolutionary socialists who had no connection to the Jewish community, but the government encouraged rumors that Jews had been responsible and organized mob attacks on Jewish communities throughout the Russian Empire followed, resulting in thousands of deaths and widespread destruction of property, and forcing hundreds of thousands of Jews to flee Russia and the territories under Russian control. By the 1890s, tens of thousands of Jewish immigrants had settled in the East End, transforming the character of districts like Whitechapel and creating new tensions and conflicts with both the existing English population and with the established Irish community. Many of these Jewish immigrants were skilled craftsmen, particularly tailors and shoemakers who had practiced these trades in Russia or Poland, and they established small workshops in the East End, often working extremely long hours for low pay in the notorious sweated trades which characterized East End manufacturing, living and working in the same cramped rooms and barely surviving on their earnings, but slowly building small businesses which might provide a path out of poverty for their children or grandchildren. The sweated trades involved the production of clothing and other goods in small workshops or in workers' homes, with workers being paid by the piece rather than by the hour, and with rates so low that workers had to labor for 12, 14, or even 16 hours per day just to earn enough to survive. This influx of immigrants created communities which were often isolated from the broader English population by language, religion, and custom, making them both vulnerable to exploitation by unscrupulous employers and landlords, and difficult for police to penetrate when investigating crimes, as residents often spoke little or no English and were reluctant to cooperate with authorities whom they associated with the oppressive governments they had fled. In Whitechapel, where many Jewish immigrants settled in the 1880s and 1890s, Yiddish was spoken as commonly as English on the streets, with shop signs in Yiddish, Yiddish newspapers serving the community, and many residents, particularly among the older generation, speaking little or no English and relying entirely on their own community networks for information and support and for mediation of disputes. Children often served as translators for their parents who could not speak English, creating unusual family dynamics in which children had access to the English-speaking world while their parents remained isolated. The area around Brick Lane and the narrow courts and alleys radiating from it became known as Little Jerusalem, with synagogues serving different traditions and communities within the Jewish population, kosher butchers and food shops ensuring that Jewish dietary laws could be observed, and Yiddish theatres providing entertainment and cultural connection to the old world, serving a population which maintained many of the customs and practices of the Eastern European shtetls, from which they had come while gradually adapting to life in England. It was in these densely populated streets where 3 or 4 families might share a single house, and where entire families lived and worked in single rooms which served as both dwelling and workshop, that several of the East End's most notorious gangs established themselves, preying primarily on their own communities but occasionally coming into conflict with English and Irish gangs over territory and criminal opportunities. The Old Nickel, a slum district located between Shoreditch and Bethnal Green, and bounded roughly by Shoreditch High Street to the west, Hackney Road to the north, and Columbia Road to the east, covering an area of only a few acres, but housing thousands of people in conditions of indescribable poverty and squalor, was home to one of the most feared criminal organisations in Victorian London, the Nickel Gang, as it was known, or sometimes simply as the Nickel, to reflect the fact that the gang was so dominant that it was synonymous with the district itself, controlled the area so completely that police officers would only enter in groups of 3 or more, and even then they faced frequent attacks from residents who would hurl bottles, bricks and excrement from windows and doorways, making any attempt to patrol the area or to arrest suspects an extremely hazardous undertaking which officers avoided unless absolutely necessary. The district itself consisted of decaying houses, many of them former weavers' cottages from the 18th century, which had been built to house Spitalfields silk weavers during the period when English silk was protected by high tariffs, and when Spitalfields silk was renowned throughout Europe for its quality, but which had been subdivided into multiple dwellings as the silk trade declined in the early 19th century, and as the area descended into poverty following the removal of protective tariffs and the influx of cheaper French and Italian silk. The streets were narrow, some barely wide enough for a cart to pass, poorly lit by inadequate gas lamps which provided only dim illumination, and which were frequently broken by vandals or not lit at all when the gas company declined to maintain service in areas where bills were not paid, and provided numerous escape routes for criminals fleeing from authorities, with passages and alleys connecting houses, and allowing someone who knew the layout to disappear from pursuit within seconds, crossing through buildings, over rooftops, and through hidden passages which did not appear on any map. The living conditions in the Old Nickel were among the worst in London and perhaps in all of Britain, shocking even to observers who were familiar with poverty in other parts of the East End. In the 1880s, the social reformer and writer Arthur Morrison, who lived near the Old Nickel and who conducted extensive research into conditions there, wrote a novel entitled A Child of the Jago, based closely on the Old Nickel, which he renamed the Jago for fictional purposes, depicting life in the slum in stark and unsparing detail, which shocked middle-class readers who had no conception that such conditions could exist in the capital of the British Empire. Morrison described families living in single rooms, which served simultaneously as bedroom, kitchen, and workshop, with no running water except from a single standpipe in the courtyard, which was shared by dozens of families and which was turned on for only a few hours per week, forcing residents to queue with buckets and containers to collect water which would have to last until the standpipe was turned on again, with inadequate toilet facilities consisting of a few privies in the courtyard which were rarely cleaned and which overflowed regularly, creating a permanent stench and spreading disease, and with the constant presence of rats, lice, and other vermin which bred in the filth and which could not be eliminated no matter how clean individual families tried to keep their rooms. Children grew up in these conditions knowing nothing else, learning from an early age that theft and violence were normal parts of life, and that survival depended on being tough, clever, and willing to do whatever was necessary to obtain food and shelter, and that the police were enemies to be resisted and evaded rather than protectors who could be called upon for help. Boys in the Old Nickel learned to fight from early childhood, as violence was a constant feature of life, and those who could not defend themselves would be victimized by others, and by adolescents, they were often members of gangs which provided protection and opportunities for income through various forms of crime. Girls faced different dangers, including sexual exploitation and pressure to enter prostitution, which for many seemed the only way to earn enough money to survive in conditions where legitimate work paid starvation wages. In the 1880s and 1890s, several gangs emerged which were associated with the Jewish immigrant community which had settled in the East End in large numbers during this period, though it should be noted and emphasized that the vast majority of Jewish immigrants were law-abiding people who worked hard to support their families through legitimate labor and who were themselves often victims of criminal predation, and that the existence of Jewish gangs reflected the poverty and desperation of life in the East End rather than any inherent criminality in the Jewish community. These organizations, while engaging in various forms of theft and illegal gambling, which were common throughout the East End, were primarily involved in protection rackets, which extracted money from the very communities they came from, targeting Jewish shopkeepers and businesses for protection payments, which were ostensibly to protect them from crime, but which in practice were extortion. Local shopkeepers and market traders, many of them Jewish immigrants, struggling to establish small businesses and to support their families through long hours of work and careful economizing, were required to pay regular sums to the gangs in return for protection from robbery and vandalism, with the weekly or monthly payments functioning as a form of taxation which cut deeply into already slim profit margins and which could mean the difference between a business surviving and failing. A small shopkeeper might earn only a few pounds per week in profit after paying for stock, rent, and other expenses, and a protection payment of even a few shillings per week represented a significant burden which reduced the family's standard of living and which might force them to reduce their stock or to cut other expenses to maintain the payments. Those who refused to pay, whether out of principle or because they simply could not afford the demands being made upon them, often found their premises vandalized, with windows broken, stock destroyed, or premises set on fire in attacks which served as warnings to others who might consider resistance. Their stock stolen in raids which might occur during business hours when the proprietor was present, or at night when premises were unattended, or themselves beaten in attacks, which might occur in their shops, on the street, or even in their homes, in violence which served as warnings to others that resistance would not be tolerated and that payment was not optional but mandatory for anyone who wished to continue operating a business in the area. The gangs justified these activities by claiming to provide genuine protection, arguing that they defended local businesses from criminals outside their organization and from rival gangs who might otherwise prey upon vulnerable shopkeepers who lacked any other means of protection in areas where police protection was minimal. And indeed, in some cases, they did defend their territory against incursions from other criminal organizations who attempted to extort businesses in areas which the established gang considered its exclusive territory, viewing businesses within their territory as their property to exploit and not wishing to see other criminals poaching on what they considered their preserve. However, the protection was protection primarily from the gang itself, and the claims of providing genuine security were largely a fiction designed to make the extortion more palatable and to reduce resistance, as shopkeepers who paid their protection money regularly and without complaint were indeed left alone by the gang, while those who did not pay faced escalating consequences which made it clear that payment was the price of being allowed to operate a business in peace. Territorial disputes between rival gangs were frequent and often resolved through violence rather than negotiation, as gangs competed for control of the most lucrative territories and for dominance in criminal activities such as gambling and protection rackets, which could generate substantial incomes. The Bessarabian Tigers, a gang which emerged in the 1890s and which drew its membership primarily from Jewish immigrants who had come from the region of Bessarabia in what is now Moldova and Ukraine, a region which had been particularly affected by pogroms and where Jews had faced severe persecution, engaged in several bitter conflicts with other East End gangs over control of gambling operations and protection territories, which could generate substantial incomes for whoever controlled them. These confrontations typically occurred in public houses, which served as social centers and meeting places for different gangs, and where rival gang members would inevitably encounter each other when both groups patronized the same establishments. At prize fights, where rival gang members would attend as spectators or participants, and where disputes might arise over gambling debts or insults, or in the streets themselves when one gang attempted to expand into another's domain by extorting businesses which the established gang considered its exclusive territory, or by recruiting members from areas controlled by rival gangs. The violence employed was often severe and brutal, with knives and razors being the weapons of choice because they were cheap, easy to obtain or manufacture, and could be carried concealed without attracting attention, and with serious injuries including slashings which left permanent scars, stabbings which could be fatal or which could cause permanent disability, or deaths not being uncommon results of these disputes. Gang members took pride in their willingness to use violence and in their ability to inflict injury on rivals, and reputations for toughness were carefully cultivated and jealously guarded, as a reputation for violence could deter challenges and could ensure that demands for protection payments were met without resistance. One particularly notorious incident, which became widely reported in the press and which shocked middle-class readers, occurred in 1895 when members of the Bessarabian Tigers confronted a rival gang at a pub near Brick Lane over what was later reported to be a dispute arising from unpaid gambling debts. Though the exact cause of the confrontation was never clearly established, as witnesses provided conflicting accounts and many were reluctant to provide information to police. The dispute, which reportedly began with verbal insults and accusations of cheating at cards, escalated rapidly into a brawl involving approximately 20 men from both gangs who happened to be present in the pub at the time. Knives and razors were drawn almost immediately, and in the fighting that followed, which lasted only a few minutes before the combatants fled upon hearing that police had been summoned, 3 men were seriously wounded, with one losing an eye when he was slashed across the face with a razor in an attack which left him permanently disfigured, another suffering stab wounds which punctured his lung and which left him with permanent breathing difficulties and unable to work, and a third receiving cuts which required dozens of stitches and which left permanent scars. Police who arrived on the scene found the pub in chaos, with blood on the floors and walls, furniture overturned, and terrified patrons who had hidden or fled when the fighting began. The injured men initially refused to provide any information about their attackers or about the cause of the fight, claiming not to know who had attacked them, despite the fact that the fight had occurred in front of dozens of witnesses, demonstrating the code of silence which prevailed in these communities and the reluctance of victims to cooperate with police even when they themselves had been seriously injured. 6 men were arrested after police conducted searches of nearby streets and found individuals with bloody clothing or with weapons, though securing convictions proved difficult as witnesses, including the victims themselves, refused to testify or claimed to remember nothing about the incident, and several of those arrested were eventually released when it became clear that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute them, while those who were convicted received relatively light sentences of a few months' imprisonment, as judges were frustrated by the lack of cooperation from witnesses and the difficulty of establishing exactly what had occurred and who had been responsible for which injuries. The East End gangs also had strong connections to bare-knuckle boxing and organized gambling, which were significant sources of income for these organizations, and which provided opportunities for gang members to demonstrate their toughness and to earn respect within their communities. Prize fights, though illegal under British law since 1750, when Parliament had passed legislation banning the sport out of concern that it promoted disorder and brutality, were regularly staged in the courtyards of public houses or in warehouses or other venues where large groups could gather away from public view, typically late at night or on Sunday mornings when police attention was elsewhere and when there was less risk of intervention, and gangs controlled access to these events, charging admission to spectators and ensuring that only those approved by the gang could attend, allowing them to profit from gate receipts while also using the events as opportunities to conduct gambling and to settle disputes between gang members or between rival gangs through organized fights. Betting on the outcomes of these fights generated substantial sums of money, with individual fights sometimes attracting wagers totaling hundreds or even thousands of pounds from spectators who wagered on the outcome, with odds being offered on various aspects of the fight, including which round it would end in and whether it would end by knockout or by one fighter conceding defeat. And the gangs took a percentage of all wagers placed, either directly by acting as bookmakers themselves and accepting bets from spectators, or indirectly by charging the independent bookmakers who operated at these events for the right to take bets in gang-controlled venues, ensuring that the gang profited regardless of the outcome of the fights. Some gang members were themselves accomplished fighters and would participate in matches both for prize money and for the prestige and reputation which came with success in the ring, using their success in fighting to enhance their reputations for toughness and to intimidate rivals who might otherwise challenge their authority, while others organized the events, securing venues, recruiting fighters, publicizing fights through word of mouth in public houses and other gathering places, and ensuring that police interference was minimal through bribery of local officers or through networks of lookouts who would provide warning of any approaching constables, allowing the event to be dispersed before police arrived. The weapons favored by East End gangs included knives of various types, from small folding pocket knives, which could be carried inconspicuously, to larger fixed blade knives, which were carried concealed in clothing, straight razors, which were particularly favored because they could inflict serious cutting wounds, and were legal to carry, as they could be claimed to be, for shaving purposes if one was stopped by police, belts with heavy buckles which could be swung like flails to strike opponents and which could cause serious injuries, including fractured skulls when used to strike the head, and koshes made from lead piping wrapped in leather, or from leather bags filled with sand or metal shot, which could be used to strike opponents, and which could cause concussions or fractures. Guns were relatively rare among East End gangs, as they were expensive and difficult to obtain, requiring either purchase on the black market at prices few gang members could afford, typically costing several pounds for even a cheap revolver, when most gang members earned only shillings per week, or theft from licensed gun dealers, which was risky and which would attract intensive police attention, and as the discharge of a firearm was certain to attract immediate police attention and investigation, making guns impractical for most purposes. Edged weapons were far more common, being cheap to obtain or easy to manufacture from materials which were readily available, and they could be used in close combat to inflict serious injuries while making less noise than firearms and attracting less immediate attention, allowing attackers to flee before police arrived. Gang members would often carry these weapons concealed in their clothing, knowing that they might need them at any moment if they encountered rivals or if they were challenged by someone who questioned their authority. And they were not hesitant to use them when confronted by rivals who challenged their territorial claims or by police officers who attempted to arrest them or to interfere with their activities, viewing violence as a necessary and legitimate means of defending their interests and their reputations. The East End gangs' activities were becoming increasingly violent by the 1880s, and into the 1890s, with assaults, stabbings, and occasional murders becoming regular occurrences in gang-controlled territories and creating an atmosphere of fear and intimidation which affected the daily lives of all residents in these areas, attracting the attention of both the Metropolitan Police, who recognized that they were losing control of significant parts of London and who faced pressure from government and from middle-class opinion to restore order, and the national press, which ran sensational stories about the lawlessness of the East End and which called for stronger measures to combat the gang problem, with headlines describing the East End as a place of savagery and barbarism, existing within a few miles of the centres of civilization and refinement in the West End. Nor was South London and the East End the only areas plagued by organised criminal gangs, as criminal organisations had established themselves throughout London. What do you think of Victorian London's street gangs? Were they the social menace portrayed by contemporary observers, or was their threat exaggerated by moral panic and sensationalist journalism? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.